Surrender Starmer. That's the label the Prime Minister.
So Keir Starmer, Your Majesty.
Your Majesty. You must be utterly exhausted and nearly on your knees.
Something has just happened in Britain that never happens. The nation's top judge has secretly called King Charles for an emergency, behind closed doors meeting. No ceremony, no tradition. This is a constitutional alarm bell ringing at full volume, and it's happening just days before Keir Starmer meets EU leaders in a summit that could quietly hand Britain back to Brussels. What is Starmer planning? And why is the King being warned now? The truth will shock you. For those who fought for and voted for Brexit, this is the nightmare scenario. The promise was simple. Britain would take back control of its borders, its laws, and its future. Millions voted for that promise, believing it would secure the nation's independence for generations. But now, less than a decade later, that independence is under direct threat. Leaks suggest that Starmer's government has been quietly drafting agreements that would restore the European Court of Justice's authority over UK-EU disputes, a court Britain fought hard to escape. If this deal goes through, the ECJ would once again hold the final say over British legal matters, a constitutional U-turn that would shred parliamentary sovereignty and place foreign judges back above the highest courts in the land. It is this potential reversal, hidden from the public eye, that sources say has pushed Britain's top judicial figure to seek an audience with King Charles. Not because the King will choose sides, but because the gravity of the situation demands that the monarch be fully aware before Starmer signs away powers that may never be recovered. And it's not just the courts under threat. Another part of Starmer's plan involves the so-called Youth Mobility Scheme, packaged as a harmless cultural exchange programme, but described by critics as a backdoor to the kind of free movement that Brexit was meant to end. It would open the gates for thousands of young EU citizens to live and work in the UK with minimal restrictions. Once such a policy is embedded, history shows it is rarely rolled back. Business lobbies and political allies will push to expand it, quietly restoring the same open border pressures that fueled the Brexit vote in 2016. Housing demand will rise, public services will strain, and job competition will intensify, all while the government insists it is simply offering opportunity and connection to Europe. The defence sphere is yet another flashpoint. Defence Secretary John Healey has already voiced his willingness for Britain to join EU-led military initiatives. On the surface, it sounds like partnership. In practice, it risks folding Britain's armed forces into EU command structures, with shared intelligence, integrated strategic planning, and joint resource pools, limits on independent military action disguised as cooperation. This is exactly the type of entanglement Brexit was meant to avoid. Once you integrate defence operations with Brussels, unwinding that integration becomes almost impossible without massive political and strategic fallout. The urgency of the judge's meeting with King Charles is rooted in the understanding that these moves, once formalised, cannot be undone with a simple vote in Parliament. They will be locked into treaties, binding Britain to the EU in ways that future governments may be powerless to reverse. That is why this unprecedented constitutional intervention is happening now. Before Starmer's meeting with EU leaders, before the handshakes, before the staged photographs, before Britain's sovereignty is signed away under the cover of diplomatic smiles. The stakes are nothing less than the future of the United Kingdom as a fully independent nation. And right now, those stakes have never been higher. What makes this moment even more dangerous is the secrecy that surrounds it. The public is being kept almost completely in the dark, fed only the carefully polished headlines about strengthening ties and shared cooperation with Europe. Behind the scenes, however, Starmer's team is reportedly working with a small circle of advisors, bypassing open parliamentary debate and ensuring that key agreements are drafted, finalised, and ready for signing before most MPs even know what's in them. This is not democracy. This is governance by stealth, where decisions that affect generations are made in quiet meeting rooms, insulated from public challenge. By the time the details become public, the deals will already be done, sealed, and binding. The people's voice, the central pillar of Britain's democratic system, is being deliberately sidelined. For Brexit voters, this is not just a policy disagreement. It is a betrayal of the 2016 referendum itself, a direct assault on the will of the majority who demanded an end to Brussels control. Central to this betrayal is the planned reinstatement of the European Court of Justice's supremacy. To those who have forgotten the scale of its reach before Brexit, the ECJ was not just a trade dispute court. It could overrule British courts on immigration cases, employment law, environmental policy, and even criminal justice. It was the embodiment of foreign oversight, where rulings made in Luxembourg could strike down decisions made by Britain's own judges and Parliament. The entire point of Brexit was to remove that oversight, to make sure that Britain's laws were made and enforced in Britain by British institutions. Yet here we are, on the brink of reimposing it, not because the people demanded it, but because Starmer's government sees political advantage in quietly aligning Britain's legal system with Europe's once again. And it is not hard to imagine what comes next. Once the ECJ's authority is restored in one area, it will creep into others until Britain's legal independence is little more than a memory. The youth mobility scheme may sound harmless on paper, but its political impact is just as dangerous. It is a Trojan horse, a friendly-sounding programme that opens the floodgates to EU migration under the guise of cultural exchange. History is littered with examples of temporary policies becoming permanent fixtures, and once the infrastructure is in place to allow free movement under a different name, reversing it becomes politically toxic and practically impossible. The pressure from business interests who profit from cheaper labour, from universities eager to boost foreign enrolment, and from pro-EU politicians who want deeper integration will make any attempt to roll it back a political suicide mission. This is why so many critics see it not as a mobility scheme, but as an immigration reset button, one that erases one of Brexit's central victories without the public even noticing until it's too late. And then there's defence. Britain's military has always stood apart from the EU, fiercely guarding its autonomy and independence in decision-making. Yet Starmer's government appears ready to plug it into EU-led defence frameworks, aligning Britain's strategic planning, sharing sensitive intelligence, and even coordinating military resources with Brussels. This may be sold to the public as cost-effective cooperation, but in practice, it risks ceding operational control to a multinational bureaucracy that does not answer to the British electorate. Once your armed forces become integrated into another power's chain of command, you cannot simply pull them back without enormous diplomatic and operational consequences. This is precisely why critics are sounding the alarm. Britain could find itself in military engagements shaped by EU priorities rather than its own national interests. The judge's urgent approach to King Charles is not a political stunt. It is a constitutional emergency brake. In Britain's unwritten constitution, the monarch has no direct governing power, but the Crown still plays a symbolic and procedural role in safeguarding the nation's fundamental order. When a matter reaches the point where the highest judge feels compelled to brief the king personally, it means the stakes are no longer just about policy. They are about the structural survival of Britain as a sovereign, self-governing state. The monarch cannot veto Starmer's plans, but he can become an undeniable moral witness to what is unfolding. His awareness, his presence in these discussions, sends a message to the public and to history. What is being done here is not routine politics. It is a redefinition of the nation's future. And right now, that future is being decided in the shadows. If there is one thing history has taught Britain, it is that the greatest losses of sovereignty rarely happen with a single dramatic announcement. They happen quietly, through a chain of small, seemingly harmless steps, each one presented as practical, necessary, or temporary. That is exactly how Britain became entangled in the European Union in the first place, starting with trade agreements, moving to shared regulations, then binding treaties, until Parliament found itself constrained by laws and rulings it could no longer change without Brussels' permission. Starmer's current strategy mirrors this playbook. By restoring the European Court of Justice's reach in targeted areas, by opening the door to new EU migration under the Youth Mobility Scheme, and by locking the UK into EU-led defence cooperation, he is building a framework of dependency, one that will be almost impossible to dismantle once it is in place. These are not isolated policies. They are interconnected levers of control that, when combined, reattach Britain to the EU's political and legal machinery without a single vote being cast by the public. This is why the judge's private warning to King Charles is such a rare and ominous sign. The British Constitution, unwritten though it is, rests on a delicate balance. Parliament makes the laws, the judiciary ensures those laws are upheld, and the monarch acts as a guardian of continuity and stability. When one of these pillars senses that another is acting in a way that could fundamentally change the country's direction without proper democratic consent, the alarm is sounded. This is not about the king choosing sides. It is about ensuring that the head of state understands the gravity of what is unfolding, so that no one can later claim ignorance when history asks how Britain's sovereignty was allowed to slip away. The very act of involving the king gives this crisis a weight that no amount of government spin can erase. It places the matter in the realm of constitutional history, not just day-to-day politics. Meanwhile, the May 19th UK-EU summit looms like a deadline. To the public, it will be dressed up in photo opportunities, smiling leaders, and vague declarations about friendship and cooperation. To insiders, it is the moment the trap snaps shut. Every handshake, every press release will be designed to conceal the binding legal commitments being signed behind closed doors. These will not be temporary arrangements. They will be structured so that Britain cannot easily walk away without severe economic, diplomatic, and legal consequences. That is the genius of the EU's approach. Once you're back inside its legal and strategic framework, leaving again becomes more painful and complex than most governments dare to attempt. Starmer knows this, Brussels knows this, and both are counting on the public being too distracted, too uninformed, or too late to stop it. The public's ignorance is not accidental, it is engineered. The government has been careful to release only the most anodyne details, ensuring that no single announcement sounds alarming enough to spark widespread outrage. The real documents, the real clauses that matter, are buried deep in negotiation drafts that the public will never see before they are signed. Even most MPs are kept at arm's length, brought in only after the key points are finalised, when it is politically awkward to object. This tactic, governing by fait accompli, turns Parliament into a rubber stamp rather than a debating chamber. It is the same strategy used to push through controversial EU treaties in the past, where leaders claimed there is no alternative once the agreements were complete. By then, resistance becomes an exercise in damage control rather than prevention. Critics are warning that this is not simply a policy dispute, it is a constitutional ambush. By the time the public understands the full scope of what has been agreed, Britain could once again be subject to EU legal supremacy, open border migration pressures, and military commitments tied to Brussels' agenda. And unlike the 2016 referendum, there may be no simple leave vote to reverse it. Instead, any future attempt to reclaim independence would require dismantling multiple interlocking agreements, each with its own legal traps and penalties. This is the kind of structural lock-in that the EU has mastered, and that Starmer appears willing to walk straight into. The stakes could not be higher, and yet most of the country remains unaware that the decision is even being made. The question now is whether this alarm, rung at the highest constitutional level, will be heard in time, or whether Britain's return to EU control will be completed quietly, without the people ever having had their say. What makes this crisis so chilling is not just the danger of the agreements themselves, it is the speed and stealth with which they are being advanced. The British public has seen political betrayals before, but rarely on a scale that strikes so directly at the heart of the nation's hard-won sovereignty. Every signal from Downing Street points to a government moving with calculated precision, determined to close the deal with Brussels before opposition can gather enough strength to block it. Starmer's team knows the political risk. They know that openly campaigning for a return to EU authority would be electoral suicide, given how deeply the Brexit vote still resonates across large parts of the country. And so, instead of confronting the public honestly, they are breaking the process into smaller, less visible steps. Each sold as harmless, each wrapped in the language of cooperation and opportunity, each hiding a piece of a much larger plan. This is the same tactic that brought Britain into the European project decades ago. Back then, leaders insisted that the European Economic Community was only about trade. There were no warnings about the gradual transfer of legislative power to Brussels, no open discussion about the eventual supremacy of the European Court of Justice, and certainly no referendum on whether British soldiers might one day operate under multinational EU command. The truth emerged only after the integration was deep enough that reversing it seemed impossible without severe economic and political disruption. Now history is repeating itself, but this time the process is unfolding at a much faster pace, under a leader who has made no secret of his admiration for European alignment. The youth mobility scheme is a perfect example of how language is being weaponised. To the average voter, it sounds like an educational exchange, a chance for British and European young people to experience each other's cultures. But behind that friendly facade lies a structural opening for mass migration flows, facilitated by loose visa rules and minimal restrictions. Once such a policy is operational, it will attract lobbying from powerful business sectors that benefit from cheap labour, from universities eager to recruit foreign students in large numbers, and from political factions that see migration as a tool to reshape the electorate itself. Over time, these pressures will ensure that the temporary or limited scheme expands into something far closer to the free movement system Britain voted to reject in 2016. By the time public dissatisfaction builds, the policy will be entrenched, defended by entire industries and international agreements that make reversal politically and legally toxic. The defence commitments carry a different but equally grave risk. Britain's armed forces have always been a symbol of independent national power, free from the influence of foreign institutions. Starmer's willingness to join EU-led defence frameworks represents a fundamental break with that tradition. Under such arrangements, operational decisions could be shaped by collective EU priorities. Intelligence could be shared in ways that compromise Britain's strategic autonomy, and military resources could be deployed in operations where the UK's direct interest is questionable. Once embedded in these structures, withdrawing becomes a diplomatic nightmare, often interpreted by allies as a betrayal, and by adversaries as a sign of instability. The EU, for its part, understands this dynamic well. Integration is easy. Separation is costly and fraught with political backlash. In the long term, such commitments could limit Britain's ability to act unilaterally in crises that demand swift, decisive action, precisely the kind of freedom that Brexit was supposed to protect. It is against this backdrop that the judge's decision to seek an emergency audience with King Charles takes on such weight. The monarch's constitutional role may be largely symbolic, but symbols matter, especially in moments of national danger. When the head of state is formally briefed on a crisis by the country's highest judicial authority, it sends a signal that cannot be ignored. It is a way of putting down a historical marker, ensuring that if Britain's sovereignty is signed away in the coming days, no one will be able to claim that the warning was not issued. It also serves as a message to those in power. This is not a routine political negotiation, it is a constitutional event of the highest order, with consequences that will echo for decades. And yet, for all the seriousness of this intervention, the government appears determined to press ahead. The May 19th summit has been framed as a reset in UK-EU relations, but the reality is that it will be the point of no return. Once Starmer shakes hands with leaders like Ursula von der Leyen and Antonio Costa, once the papers are signed and the photo ops complete, Britain will be bound by agreements that alter the balance of power between London and Brussels in ways that are difficult, if not impossible, to reverse. Legal supremacy will once again tilt towards the European Court of Justice. Borders will be opened incrementally under the guise of youth mobility. Military commitments will tie the hands of future governments, forcing them to consult Brussels before taking their independent action. This is not speculation, it is the logical conclusion of the policies already on the table, the very policies the government has been working to shield from public scrutiny. The real tragedy is that the people, the same people who voted decisively to leave the EU, are being cut out of the process entirely. There will be no referendum this time, no national debate, no chance to weigh the pros and cons before the decision is made. By the time the details are public, they will not be up for discussion. They will be facts of law and treaty, embedded in the machinery of government. Those who oppose them will be told that reversing course would be reckless, that Britain must honour its commitments, that our partners would lose trust in us. This is how sovereignty is lost, not with a bang, but with a carefully managed series of small concessions, each defended as harmless, until the day arrives when independence exists only in name. The judge's meeting with King Charles is, in many ways, the last visible warning before this process becomes irreversible. It is the constitutional equivalent of pulling the emergency brake. Whether it will be enough is another matter entirely. For the warning to have any effect, it must be heard beyond the palace walls. It must reach the public in time to generate the kind of political pressure that no government can ignore. That will not be easy. The media is deeply divided, with some outlets inclined to present Starmer's actions as diplomatic genius rather than constitutional vandalism. Others may bury the story under the noise of daily politics, treating it as just another squabble between Brexit hardliners and Europhiles. But for those who understand what is at stake, the picture is clear. This is not just about the EU or about Starmer's personal politics. It is about whether Britain remains the master of its own destiny, or quietly slips back into a system it fought hard to leave. The days ahead will determine the answer. If the summit proceeds as planned, if the agreements are signed without public consultation, then Britain will have crossed a line it may never be able to step back from. The sovereignty reclaimed in 2016 will be compromised, and future generations will inherit a nation bound by rules it did not choose. The judge's warning, the King's awareness, the voices of those who fought for independence, these may be remembered only as footnotes in the story of how it was lost. But there is still a narrow window, a final chance to pull back before the ink dries. The question is whether anyone in power is willing to act, or whether Britain's fate will be sealed in the quiet meeting rooms of Brussels and Westminster, far from the eyes of the people whose future is being decided. Because make no mistake, if Starmer's plan succeeds, it will not be the last time Britain's independence is chipped away. It will be the beginning of a new cycle of integration, one that pulls the country ever deeper into Europe's orbit, without ever asking the public if that is the future they want. And once that cycle begins, history suggests it will be decades, if ever, before the UK has another chance to break free. This is why the stakes are so high, why the warning from the judiciary to the monarchy is so urgent, and why the silence surrounding this crisis is so dangerous. The public deserves to know. The public deserves a voice. But unless that voice is raised now, loudly and without hesitation, Britain may soon wake to find that the sovereignty it fought to reclaim has been quietly signed away, behind closed doors, while the rest of the nation wasn't looking.